Hello everyone, Kevin again here from the Cyber Distortion podcast, and I'm locked in tonight with my partner in crime, Jason Popillion, and we're here to bring you the second in a two-part series on ransomware. And so like we told you last week, if you've ever been hit with ransomware or don't want to get hit with ransomware, or if you just simply think that ransomware sucks, well guess what, you're right. It really does suck. You do not want to get hit with ransomware. But we just had a very enlightening conversation with our guest for tonight. This is going to be fun, it's going to be engaging, and it's going to be exciting. And I guarantee you're going to learn something good from tonight. So, Jason, what do you think about our guest for tonight? What are our listeners going to think?
Man, let me tell you, if you've ever wanted to know about hackers, how hackers think, how ransomware moves through your system, the evolution of ransomware from the beginning to where it is today and where it is evolving to be, this is the episode you want to see. Look, I keep telling you guys, you don't want to miss this one. It's going to be exciting and fun, and I know that, but I don't know what to tell you. This is the one that's going to be a lot of fun. We've got a great guest, and this guy is going to take us deep behind the covers of ransomware to give you guys information you won't hear anywhere else. So guess what? Buckle up. It's about to get real. Hey, welcome to the Cyber Distortion podcast. I told you guys we're going to have a really, really exciting guest, and I'm going to break it down to you guys now. Our guest has an incredible backstory, and I'll let him tell you more about that. But I'm going to introduce him to you. His name is David Bonvillain, and David is the vice president of Halcyon.ai, a company that's specializing in stopping ransomware. And that statement doesn't do the full justice on how deep they're willing to go in order to really make a change and do something with ransomware and all other attacks as well. But he has over 20 years experience in IT, and you know what? The story is so cool, I'm going to let him tell it. So David, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I'm David Bonvillin. I run sales engineering at Halcyon right now, but I've been in the InfoSec space for 20 some odd years, started in the late 90s. And I started coding on a Commodore 64 when I was 10, after watching war games and wanting to, basically war dial the country and change my grades and cool shit like that. Then I guess late 90s, a company called ISS was actually acquiring a company that had just hired me when I just started in the game. ISS, it turns out, has been kind of a stem of a lot of the who's who that were in the industry. I mean, there was a handful of companies in the early days, the at-stakes and whatnot, that a lot of the, kind of what became the leaders and pioneers of the industry really came out of. So I got lucky being involved over there. Met some of the guys actually that I work with still now at Halcyon. Some of the guys from the X-Force R&D team, as well as their kind of attack and pen sort of group. And then in early 2000s, I was the first employee at a company called Accuvant, where I then brought over a bunch of my friends and cohorts that I had known over at ISS and known through the years. And we developed a team called Accuvant Labs. I'm actually still sporting one of the shirts to this day. And we built one of the largest kind of technical consultancies in the world, I guess, at that point, that was focused on reverse engineering, malware analysis, penetration testing, all the way to kind of risk and compliance sort of work. We did a little bit of everything, but we were involved in, the big Sony hack, and we, would take apart, products for some of the leading manufacturers out there. It was really cool work, and we had one of the best teams in the world. It was awesome. We would throw down at huge parties at Black Hat, and it was really cool. And then we just developed Halcyon. It actually just came out of stealth a few weeks ago. We hit our GA release in a week or two, and it's basically the first dedicated anti-ransomware engine, which is one of the biggest problems we face today, and so I'm glad to be here talking about it.
Yeah, so the Sony hack, you remember that one, Kevin? I mean, that was a while ago, but I remember that one rocking the world when that happened. In fact,
a lot of pissed off gamers, man.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, there were.
Yeah, that's the one world you don't want to disrupt is the gamer community, because they can get pretty nasty.
Those nights too, we had a team on site like 24/7 for an extended period of time. Like I remember late nights and early mornings, and I wasn't even on site, but I would be there on FaceTime and Google Hangout meetings, and it was that was a crazy project.
Yeah, I bet.
I'm sure. Well, David, that's fascinating. Your backstory is pretty incredible, and we said something on last week's episode how we like to keep the content and what we're trying to cover a little bit cybersecurity 101, but I have a feeling we're going to delve a little deeper this week, which is going to be really cool. I can't wait to get into this.
Ransomware, and we'll get into this more, but so just to note, I'd stepped out of the industry for a little while after the Accuvant acquisition. So I was watching what was going on and then getting to come back in fresh. One of the things that struck me is it's the most impactful, exploit that I've really seen that really drives the point home to executive audiences, to everybody, because there's no missing it, right? When a ransomware event hits, your machine's locked up, all your files are locked up. I mean, and it's so many steps of every phase of a penetration test or of a vulnerability analysis. And it's so many of the steps that we used to reinforce when we would go in and do a pen test or do a vulnerability assessment or, compliance audit, even, that it's just from a technical perspective, it's very interesting to watch that evolution and then how advanced it's gotten. Right. So yeah, we have to get a little bit there.
Yeah, for sure. And we were talking a little bit about that before we got started tonight, and we will get into the evolution of ransomware, because that's a pretty fascinating topic in and of itself. But yeah, when you think about it, I mean, it's just the perfect crime that you can perform in cybersecurity, because if you're not protected, or if some 0-day comes out and there's a vulnerability that you haven't covered, you're exposed. Yeah. And once you get hit with it, there is no way out of it if you came in unprepared. If you're not backing up your data and if you have no ability to recover those systems or recover that data, you're pretty much SOL. So it's the perfect crime, and hey, kudos to the people that thought of it. It's a very creative
from an attacker's
thing.
Perspective. How else do you monetize your 0-day, right? In that sense, right? Outside of selling the 0-day to somebody else that's going to use it maliciously and maybe target somebody, whatever. But those are pretty abstract, ways to really bring in revenue. I mean, this is straight up thievery and extortion.
Well, not only that, you can request the form of payment in a way that's not even trackable back to you. Right? Now that there's blockchain.
I mean,
well, here's the thing, right? So in a successful business model, you want one very good, successful revenue stream, right? But if you get two successful revenue streams, man, you're bringing in the bank. These guys are getting 3 and 4 revenue streams through this model, man.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Wait a second. And again, we'll dive into it more later. But if you think about it, a ransomware as a service operator has hundreds of affiliates, right? And so they have hundreds of other groups that are actively leveraging their software. They're only pulling a 10 or 20% rip, right? But that's cool because they got hundreds of those guys out there. They got hundreds of kookaroos, right? They're not worried about any of that.
Getting royalties off of the thieves.
Right? I mean, it's an amazing architecture. There's an entire network of people that have just gotten the initial hack done, and they're like, well, I could use that myself and go ahead and compromise this environment. but I'm just going to do this 10,000 times and just sell all of it off, right? I'm going to make only a little bit of the cut, but I make it thousands of times, right? I mean, it's brilliant in a, dirty sort of way.
It is, right? It is.
It's almost like a hacker
Ponzi
scheme or something.
And wildly successfully executed, and to the point that it has literally now become organized crime.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, well, let's get into some content here. We talked about, leveraging some of your backstory and some of the experience you have in helping companies to protect themselves. So one of the things that we wanted to kick off and talk about tonight is ransomware preparation. And I think that's a perfect place to start given what we just talked about. So David, from your perspective, if you're talking to a prospective customer or heck, just one of your buddies at happy hour and you're talking cybersecurity, what do you tell them from a personal standpoint is the best approach to take to protect themselves? And then how would you change that if you were talking to someone about a business?
Well, it's sort of challenging, right? So, the best way to protect yourself, ultimately, once our tool is actually fully out there and rolled out, that's going to be a great way to protect yourself. But stepping back from just a single kind of point technology, it's really, for one, you have to have it's user awareness kind of at the core, right? But unfortunately, user awareness always fails, right? There's always that's going to lose on that. But it really starts there and then goes all the way through the environment, all the way down to the endpoint with the right controls, the right training, the right segmentation, and really executive level support, which is actually one of the coolest things that came out of all the ransomware activity, is that you actually have the awareness at the board level. And of one thing out of information security that they're always going to be asking these days is, what the hell are we doing about ransomware? And that then drives budgets for security teams to be able to actually implement the controls that they've probably been screaming about for quite a while. Because if you think about outside of the ransomware event itself of, it encrypting files and, locking up the machine and, extorting the cache, there's been a failure all the way through the security program before you've ever gotten down to, I have an actual executable on the host that's going to encrypt a bunch of things and put up a splash screen, right? So it's all of those controls that guys like us have been talking about, for decades, basically, because it's a missing patch, it's weak passwords, it's, a phishing attack that got the initial access in there. And it's those things, if they weren't occurring in the first place, that the ransomware, that executable would never get to fire off. Right. Now, once it fires off, then you're dealing with a different issue. And, there's technologies out there now to start grabbing the symmetric keys to try and be able to do decryption on the fly. Robust backups. But the problem with backups is, have you actually gone through and restored those things, right? So that's one of the big things, is going and actually executing your BCDR plan and going through the exercise regularly, because a lot of times folks have made a huge investment in all that stuff and they haven't actually leveraged it and they don't really know how well it's going to work, right? So it's outside of saying, hey, there's some new technologies that are coming out that actually leverage deep learning, machine learning models that, can actually identify this better and take proactive action against the executable itself. It's really a comprehensive security program all the way up the stack, because that's where you need to stop it. Once it's already fired off, yes, there are technologies being developed and that are coming out that can help us be able to mitigate the actual impact of the event itself. But it's really the comprehensive security program in front of that, and then the tiers of technology that support that security program.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because when we look at policies and procedures and how policies and procedures play a role in keeping you safe, I think what happens is most often people think, oh, I created a policy and I outlined what procedures we have to follow. We're good, right? And they walk away from it. Well, what I like to tell my teams are that policies and procedures need to constantly be evaluated and updated. But even more important than that is you need to practice how you're going to play. You don't want to wait until the crisis moment to figure out how to make this stuff happen. That is the wrong time to do it. You want your team ready, just like a team would be ready for a sporting event, right? To manage anything that was unknown in that game. That's what you want your team to do. And so practicing your BCDR, having tabletop exercises. I tell you, the best thing we've done is I have a set of 12 tabletop exercises that we run once a month. And I take my incident response team and have them execute it as if they don't know anything about the event until the day we execute it. I'm the only one that knows about it. And we execute the event, and I'm just writing down everything that they need to improve on. And when we're done, I reevaluate it again, and we look at everything that we need to improve on, and we set corrective action plans for all of those pieces that they didn't do well on. So, because that is the only way you're going to be ready for something like this when it occurs.
Yep.
Yeah, practice makes perfect is never more true as it relates to incident response and disaster recovery. And you said something interesting, David, about backups, recovering through backups, and the technology for that. And it got me thinking, one challenge that I don't think is talked about enough when it comes to incident response is the changing technology, because that can just as easily bite you in the ass if you need to recover data from technology that has advanced to the point where technically you've got backups 3-4 years old, and you might need to go back that far to recover some data. But if you no longer have the technology in place to read those backup formats, that's a bad day at the office right there. And you hear about that quite a bit more often than you would think.
Well, I mean, it's hard to go through those exercises, right? I mean, it's a pain in the butt to do it. And at least on a limited scale, like, you need to go through those processes, or else it's a waste of time to have done it in the first place. Right. And ultimately, we all know, like, all these attacks are going to happen on a weekend, on a holiday, right? Like, it's never going to be at a convenient time.
In the middle of the night. Yeah, right.
For sure.
So let's switch gears a little bit here. Let's talk about security layers. And to the non-technical audience, the technical people always hear about the importance of creating security layers. But when we look at security layers, regardless of where it is, if it's perimeter, if it's your network layers, if it's endpoint protection, your end users, could you explain for our listeners what you believe is most important about security layers and why?
So all of this is a concept that's referred to as defense in depth, which really comes from military practices of, each tier of defense should reinforce the other one, right? And if you breach one tier, you don't want to be hard and crunchy on the outside and soft and chewy on the inside, right? Which was a very common network analogy, at least back in the day, of how a lot of network architectures were structured. The way to think about how that really gets implemented, especially in today's space with really advanced endpoint agents, right, that have the kind of the next gen EPP and XDR capabilities. At each stage of an attacker's perspective on the environment, they should be met with another battery of defenses that try and prevent them from doing what they're doing, right? So whether that's their initial access into the environment, their pivot off of that access into the environment, they're then traversing into another system and being able to escalate privileges, being able to exfiltrate data, each of those, just getting access back to their command and control server, right? Because even in the ransomware space, a lot of it is human operated at this point. There is an automated component, and then there's human interaction as far as being able to say, well, no, I wanted to do this now. Like the most advanced versions, they'll worm themselves out. They'll do their own data exfiltration. They'll capture credentials, and they'll do all of that before actually firing off an encryption function that really locks up the machine. So it's at each stage of that whether it's your intrusion prevention systems, or whether it's, your gateway filtering and like your proxies, or your, the way that you've segmented all your VLANs so that all your critical assets aren't accessible by something that would be able to breach into a particular environment, right? It's those controls that as an attacker that I'm going to be trying to get over every step of the way. And, part of the concept is just making it harder than the next guy. Because if you think of the concept of, okay, well, these guys really just bought initial access from some broker that broke into the first stage. That broker doesn't really know how hard it is to get through the rest of my environment. And as long as my environment's way harder than the other 100 guys that he bought access to, they're probably going to bail, right?
Yeah.
And at least from the security admin side, it's like, oh, thank God, right? Because I don't want to have to worry about every single one of those stages all the way down to my endpoint. If they can just start looking in another direction because of all my fortified defenses all the way to the perimeter, it helps me sleep at night and, helps me keep my job with my CIO.
Right. Yeah. And one key point there to bring up or to re-bring back up again is when we talk about segmentation, network segmentation, and you were saying, it might be, segmenting your VLANs for all of your critical resources. And an example of that for our audience would be backups. Whatever your backup system is for backing up your environment, you do not want to also have your backups exposed on the same network in any way that is actually being attacked. You want that off access to that network, because if an attacker, they're going to go directly for there, because they do not want you to be able to come back up and say, this isn't a big deal. Oh, I'm not going to pay you. I'm just going to restore all stuff from backup, and I don't really care. Right? They want you to be down.
Right? Like your volume shadow service is targeted by most variants these days, so it can corrupt what at least is accessible locally. And so, absolutely. Having all the backups segmented off. I mean, a lot of people are moving to, kind of a zero trust sort of model, even at this point, where, you only have access to what you need to have access to, and ain't nobody a trusted user, really. And that's probably the right way to approach it.
Okay, let's recap some of what we've seen so far in tonight's episode. First, a comprehensive ransomware strategy always revolves around a few key elements. You want to build a comprehensive business continuity and disaster recovery plan, and you're going to want to implement policies and procedures with your plan in mind. Exercise your policies and procedures regularly. You'll want to perform system failovers and tabletop exercises. These types of exercises are valuable lessons learned opportunities, which can lead to improvements over time. You also want to test your backups. Like other technology, backup technologies can get outdated quickly. Always make sure your backups are recoverable. The best protection is an educated user. Ransomware is always centered around user awareness. Training is an absolute must. And then lastly, you want to address weak passwords. Strong passwords should just be a staple of your strong security policy. We also took a look at security in layers tonight, also known as defense in depth. Every stage of an attack should be met with new defenses. It starts at your perimeter and always ends at your end user. There are many other layers in between. Your goal as a security expert should be to make it harder than it is for the next guy. Hackers will often bail when the going gets tough. Defense in depth works laterally as well. Segmentation within your network is huge. Separate your critical systems from the rest of your network.
Hey, we're back. So, David, I thought it would be interesting now, after we've kind of hit some of these topics, to really dive deeper into the history of ransomware. It has progressed and has gone through several different stages. And I thought it would be interesting to hear from you about, how it got started, where it is today, and where it looks like it's projected to go, and how is it morphing as it continues to steal all of our money and screw up all of our systems.
As it evolves.
That's a good one. So, it's interesting. It officially, I guess, starting at the beginning, the first official credited ransomware was the AIDS Trojan from the late 80s. And it was a disk that was, and I can't remember the exact function, but it was supposed to be for AIDS research. And it kind of was. It was a doctor that had done it, and I think he had been formally trained. He actually had done some research on baboons in Africa and was involved with AIDS research. But basically, when you put the disk in, it had a licensing scheme associated with it that nobody read, right? Because you're just installing. And the licensing scheme basically said that, after a certain amount of time, it was going to lock up your system. And nobody read that, right? And basically, if you wanted to pay the license fee, you sent it to this like weird PO box in the middle of nowhere. And supposedly, you would have paid the license fee. Well, it ends up nobody paid the license fee. And after 90 cycles, the thing would just lock your system and give you a splash screen of like, pay us or you ain't getting your system back. And so officially that was the first one, right? And from there, it kind of went into sort of like malware, right? Where it was just sort of like I was saying earlier, like sort of just shoot and spray. It was targeted at end users that would be, $50, $100, $200. And, and there was no real sophistication to it. It was basically a cryptor, right? In the sense of like a type of malware that just finds files of a specific type sometimes, right? Like they would put in, specific types of files for specific types of file extensions. And then it would just go through and encrypt those things and then put up a little file that said, like you owe us a couple $100 if you pay them. And literally, I had one earlier that was the little file that dropped up. Is the
pop up? Yeah.
And back then it was only like 50 or 100 bucks.
It wasn't much.
No big deal on it.
And a lot of times too, you could decrypt it, right? They weren't sophisticated encryption routines without going into like the nuts and bolts of how that stuff works. Like. Right. From a cipher perspective, it was, very basic, and anybody with, some basic reverse engineering skills a lot of times could take it apart and figure out how to bypass whatever it is that they had built in, and then they just, build their own decryptor that would, go through and restore the files. It then sort of interestingly evolved rapidly because it kind of stayed like that for a while, and then it was around 2019, 2017, 2018, you started seeing a lot more activity. 2019 was where things started really getting nasty, right? And you started seeing really advanced software development and software that really acted more like professionally developed software than just malware in its, kind of raw dog sense. And along with that, it also became very difficult to detect because unlike your average malware that just is obviously nefarious, right? It's keystroke logging, it's process injecting, right? It's doing bad things that are inherently bad. Ransomware doesn't necessarily. It's open reading and writing files, right? It's deleting files. It's doing stuff that like common backup and recovery software would do. And so things weren't able to identify it nearly as well because it operated a lot differently than malware did, yet was being classified in this malware space. And, endpoint detection systems just weren't really inherently trained to be able to identify that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So then you started seeing people be like, well, wait a second, like if it's working at this level and we're already in this environment, what else can I do? And they started, building more advanced software to target companies to where they could actually get a lot more money for it, right? And then you started, so that then became your APT kind of scenario of where they're going to really research what the company is, what the company does, what their revenue is, how many employees they have. Do they have cyber insurance, right? Because if they have a cyber insurance policy and they could get a copy of that policy by pilfering through files in the environment, they'd be like, well, these guys got $5 million in coverage. Let's hit them for $5 million, right? Like it'll be... They're not even going to pay it, right? It's going to be their insurance company. It's just how it works. Yay, we all got paid. Well, after the first one works, right? It's like everybody's hammering this. And so they then literally set up business entities that farm out the software to other folks, affiliates like we were talking about earlier, that farm out the software to folks that are going to actually be the ransomware gang, so to speak, that are going to break in, right? Well,
So that's the ransomware as a service.
Yep, absolutely. And that's really what we're seeing today, right? Is that, the smaller operators or a guy that's going to code this himself is more of a rarity than not because you have organized businesses behind developing the software, and then you have organized groups, and we're not talking like businesses of hundreds of people, right? It's a dozen folks, right? But they're good at what they do, and then they have a whole slew of other affiliates out there that are willing to use that software to take the actual risk of I'm going to go ahead and do the compromise, I'm going to bust in, I'm going to do this. It's actually part of what you saw with DarkSide saying, hey, we're going back through and auditing our affiliates after the Colonial Pipeline hack, right? Because they aren't wanting that kind of profile either necessarily, because they want to keep operating and making a bunch of money. Well, so then you're at this like advanced software, very organized, very, nefarious kind of organization that's going on between all of these different components that make it all kind of come together and work. And then Q4 of 2019, you have the first version. It was a software called Maze that would actually exfiltrate data prior to locking everything up, right? Prior to running its crypto routines. And with that, key. They were then able to say, well, wait a second, you don't want to pay to get your systems back, but we have all your data. And we're going to release a little bit of it, or at least show you a little bit, just to show that it's legit and that you don't want us to expose this. And if you don't pay us in X amount of time, we're going to release this either publicly as like a shaming embarrassment kind of thing, or we're just going to sell it to the highest bidder. And whether that's somebody else wanting to compromise you or your partners, because imagine the partner impact, right? Just the impact all the way down the chain to the business's reputation and their ability to continue to operate as they did prior to the event. It's a catastrophic impact at that point. So, and that's been going on basically since Q4 2019. 2020 and 2021 were just heydays. Like everybody's getting hammered. In fact, there's statistics of like 60 some odd % of the Fortune 2000 have gotten hit in the last 12 months, which then alludes to the fact that, because the organizations, the gangs, quote unquote, are at least trying not to hit the same organization twice, because that would, it looks bad, right? And they're very unlikely to get paid at that point. So they're trying to play nice in their own kind of perspective of what playing nice means. And so you got to figure if even half of them got hit last year, well, the other half is probably going to get hit this next year unless they've done all of these other things. And as we were talking about earlier, there's always that random system. There's always that susceptible user, right? So it really comes down to all these different tiers. Well, so fast forward now to the beginning of 2022, a few weeks ago, for the first time, we also saw an evolution again of, I'm not only going to exfiltrate your data and lock up your systems, but if you don't pay, then we're going to DDoS your environment. And so it's, like a triple extortion tactic of knowing that they aren't going to be, a lot of that is also coming to fruition because of the pressure that they're getting on not paying the fees, right? And then there's groups like Chainalysis that actually track Bitcoin transactions through the clearinghouses, because there's basically, as an operator of ransomware, there is a group that I have to pay in order to wash my Bitcoin, basically, right? And not have it tracked back to me. There's a group that I pay for my initial access. There's a group that I pay for the software that I'm using as my cryptor and for my extortion routine, right? So I got to pay for my hosting. I got to pay for this, right? There's all those different components that go out. So now that they're getting all the pressure on, hey, I may not actually get paid, they're just, well, I'll DDoS you then. So you got to pay us, right? Because one way or the other, you're out of business if you don't. So
it sounds interesting, right? Because it sounds like we started off just saying, hey, pay us for this software or this data, or we're just going to make it so your machine won't operate, and we'll lock it. And in order to unlock it, you're going to have to, pay us so that you can get that back. Then it went to, we're going to kind of softly encrypt your data on your little personal machine, and we're going to tell you to pay us because that's important. But they saw some traction, not as much traction, but they saw some traction on there.
Well, because the next does the mom, your grandma want those pictures, right?
I'll be done with it. And then we saw, let's make this into a bigger business, right? Let's start doing something bigger with this, because if we go after companies instead of grandma, we might be able to, turn this into something. And so now, and we saw that business evolution. And so now we're seeing, even though we've gotten into the business evolution, there's still been some degree of holdouts that aren't allowing them to get paid, me being one of them. And so now they're saying, look, dude, pay me, or I'm just going to beat your system down. And for our audience who aren't technical, we did get pretty deep in there, but a DDoS attack is a distributed denial of service attack. And what they're basically doing is beating your system down so that none of your other internet traffic can come in or out of your environment, and it just destroys it, makes it come to a crawl. And so they're saying, we won't allow you to do business because we're going to make your entire system crawl, and you're going to want to pay us when we're done with you, right? So it's crazy to see how far this thing just continues to morph into being in the attackers' control, because they're going to find another method to come at you with. Yep. And, you know, in the last episode, I kind of broke this down into some simple math. And you just said something earlier. You said, well, you know, these guys have hundreds of affiliates, right? And so these affiliates could be executing attacks. Well, you take, let's just say, you know, simple math was take two of these affiliates, and these affiliates are doing simultaneously, just randomly decided to do phishing attempts against one company that had 1,000 employees. And they only did 10 phishing attempts. That's all they did. That's all they did. That is 20,000 attempts to capture your corporate credentials. And now we're saying they got 100, affiliates out there, and they're not going to stop at just doing it 10 times. Well, they've profiled you for a reason.
This is just kind of an interesting nuance for the security geeks out there, is that, you know, when the same guys are hitting the same organization, there are checks in the software. So the software has gotten advanced enough that it has several routines at the beginning of its execution that says, have I already hit this machine before, right? So there'll be residuals from, you know, whatever version, let's say alpha, right? That it's like, oh, well, this machine's already been compromised. I'm not going to hit it again. And so it'll actually have an exit. There'll be conditional statements that say, am I on a Russian machine, or am I, and not even necessarily Russian. It's like there's a handful of kind of federated states that are all very friendly with Russia, right? They will look for those.
They're on the clean list.
Yeah, they'll look for that clean list, right? And they'll only. That's the way that they operate with impunity in a particular geography, is they're not going to hit local systems, right? Yeah. And so they have kickbacks to the government or wherever it is that they're operating from, for the local police, to make sure that they don't get arrested. So all of those things are kind of built into it to try and make sure that, you know, if my other affiliate that's also part of the same network using the same software, if they just hit these guys last week, you know, I'm not going to, because my software won't actually run, and you just move on to the next target. That's also, I think, part of why we've seen such a proliferation of it, is that, you know, there is some rules of the game, so to speak. Also with like providing decryptor keys. I heard somebody say the other day, well, they don't even always provide the keys. It's like, well, I think there was one case of that, and it's because the guy had got put in jail.
It's a very, very...
Yeah, because ultimately that's their business, right? Like if they start not providing keys, they ain't going to get paid, and it ruins their reputation. And they're literally trying to run some sort of black market corporation. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Let's quickly recap what we've learned on our history and evolution of ransomware discussion. We learned that ransomware has been around since the 80s. It started with a disk-based Trojan written by a biologist. It was released via floppy disk before most of us had ever even had an opportunity to touch a computer. This was back in 1989. Really early forms of malwares included cryptor malware, which really just locked files with weak encryption, and the attackers would ask for minimal payouts. Targets were usually civilians. There was a rapid evolution that started around 2017. We started to see much more professionally developed software, which is much harder to detect, and it's far more sophisticated. These days, companies have become the largest targets. And with bigger targets and larger payouts, that means ransomware organizations are more run like businesses. Nefarious ransomware organizations now farm out their software. This is called ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service is actually built on the software as a service model. Ransomware can now exfiltrate data before the encryption. This gives the attackers even more leverage. This is known as ransomware 2.0. Now in 2022, there is a new type of ransomware, the worst yet. Attacks are exfiltrating data, encrypting data, And then for those that are not willing to pay the ransom, they're even being threatened with DDoS attacks against their networks. We learned that DDoS attacks basically shut down your network due to consuming every bit of your bandwidth to the internet. This level of ransomware, the most sophisticated level of ransomware to date, is called Ransomware 3.0. Well, hey, before we close this thing up, guys, I wanted to tell you about a website that's really cool if you don't already know about it, and tell the listeners about it. But if you haven't done this, go to Google and search "Information is Beautiful" on ransomware attacks. And they have an amazing, down to the day at least, bubble chart that gets built dynamically, and it shows you by year all of the different large ransomware attacks. And it's so cool because based on the size of the bubble on the chart determines the impact of that breach to that particular company. And you can filter it on who paid, who refused to pay, and it's just really cool data. And there's another one, Information is Beautiful, on world's biggest data breaches. So check that out when you get a chance, but it's really cool stuff. And I screen capture that and use that in a lot of presentations for executive management and things like this, because it's just really cool data to look at.
Yeah. We probably think it's a lot cooler than the executive audience, dude.
Oh, I'm sure.
Well, to me, it's just the way it's laid out and the thought that went into that and the amount of data that you can get from one little chart. It's just really cool. And if you click on the bubbles, it actually takes you to more data. You can break down and read how many records were stolen and the amount of the ransomware. There's a lot of data.
Yeah, it's awesome. Really cool. Honestly, taking apart ransomware at a binary level is wildly interesting, right? Like as it's gotten more advanced, like being able to, dig in and like just see how all that stuff works. It's really cool stuff.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Maybe we're going to have you back on another episode later and show that as a live stream.
I know, right?
So cool.
Reverse some stuff and fire off some variants, man. We can fire up a VM and like I got a mess of RAM.
God, that'd be
all
so
right,
cool.
We're going to do that in a later episode. I like that.
Dig it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Jason, why don't you close this out, man, and talk a little bit about next week's episode?
Sure will. Listeners. So, David, I want to thank you for your time. As you know, these are the types of conversations that we really have to hold ourselves back from going way extra long on, because they're so engaging. We can get into so much information. I know that our viewers are going to get a lot of really key, good information out of here. Even if it doesn't do anything for them to practically apply something today, it's going to help them in just general understanding of why this is happening and where the trajectory is headed, so that they can start preparing. So I appreciate all of your efforts in joining us tonight and sharing all of your knowledge with us and with our audience. And I look forward to having you back on so we can do more of this stuff.
I appreciate you guys having me. Seriously, like it was a lot of fun. You guys are doing awesome stuff. It was great hanging. Like seriously, I'll geek out on this stuff anytime, anywhere.
Good. Yeah, as will we. It's very hard to stop talking about this stuff, man.
So really everyone, I want to have you join us again next week. Next week, we're going to dive deep into a perspective of business, and our title for next week is Cybersecurity: A Manager's Perspective. And so we want to share with you how managers look at cybersecurity. What are some of those pitfalls and holes and stumbling blocks that you have to go through in order to get good, effective cybersecurity practices put in place in your organization so that your executive team buys into it and understands what's happening? We had a great guest on next week, Senior Vice President of automotive aftermarket company that services the European makes. And I think he's got a tremendous amount of information to offer. And so it'll be another good series to listen to. So again, David, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We had a lot of fun, and we look forward to doing it again.
Rock on. See you guys.
Hello, everyone. If you enjoyed the podcast today, I'm excited to share with you that you can now listen to us on all of these major streaming platforms. Also, if you learned anything from the conversation today, please share this episode with your friends, family, and colleagues. The more of this knowledge we can share, the more cyber secure we all become. I'd say like, subscribe, and all of that jazz, but hey, you're not morons. You know that. I will leave you with some words of wisdom, though, from the former director of the FBI, Mr. Robert S. Mueller III. He said there are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. You guys be safe, remain diligent, and take care.